I'm a Theta energy healer. I do a lot of coaching, but also my background's in the arts and culture sector and creative industries, and I do a lot of work in anti-racism facilitation and governance. And I bring up those two things in particular because I'll get into the energy side of things and kind of what's in this book and do a bit of a reading. But I think what is a really important context for this book, especially if we think about the phrase make good trouble and Senator John Lewis and the civil rights movement in the United States, and that being a phrase he really coined, so that we're in an age of disruption. We always have been in an age of disruption when we think about the process of creation, that kind of coming to an end, a death of some sort, a kind of transmutation, a kind of change and transformation into a rebirth. The intention for this book is that readers that are already interested in disrupting the status quo, or if not, disrupting themselves, their own lives, their own habits, beliefs, and behaviors, that this will be a companion to that deep work. I think something that's really important as well is we often associate disruption with chaos, with being out of control, with changes that are overwhelming, and depending on your relationship to disruption and to energy and to chaos, that can be something that's enticing and familiar or something that feels really, really uncomfortable. So a lot of this book is actually about leaning into that discomfort. And as Ella mentioned beautifully, this book is framed in a couple of ways. So you can read this in any way that you like. You could take this book as a practical guide to help you think about your core values, what's important to you, how you actually reflect those in your day-to-day life. Is that something that shows up in your actions, in your relationships, in your work, in your family, in your communities, in your environment? You could read this as a book that's about leadership and the abuse of power, and actually how we process some of the uses of power we see in our world and our society. And you could also take this book as a deeply kind of spiritual practice. There are reflective tools, there are exercises in each chapter that cover things like intuition, psychic intuitiveness, how to kind of not only ground yourself in your own values, but also how do you protect your energy, and how do you feel and engage with energy in the wider world. So, without explaining too much more, I'll read you a section of the book. And as we mentioned earlier, this book engages with the tarot, and the idea is that, this book actually is asking you as a reader to embrace the energy of the Fool in the Major Arcana, the card that is all about this call to adventure, that's about being a fool for life, or a fool of life, being open to being impacted by life. And it asks the reader, if you embrace the energy of the Fool and embrace this kind of unknown, this journey will unfold in front of you. So it starts with the Fool, and very quickly kind of moves into this whole notion of living on the edges. And whether or not you think about the tarot card of the Magician or the Hermit and all that those cards represent, wise people, seers on the fringe of society that are our guides, that are being led by deep wisdom, that need to step back from society at times to have some time for reflection and space to observe and then to share later on, or the Magician that kind of takes these core elements and transmutes these elements into something magical, into something else. This is all about asking us to be open to the process of change and transformation. And what I'll start with this evening is a passage that's about this. It's about living on the edges and what that means. And there's a little story about a teacher that really impacted my life, Mrs. Jones, who you'll hear about very, very shortly. But I'll start now. Embodying the energy of living on the edges. Those of us who work with energy and spend our days observing the subtle flows, changes, and nuances are highly attuned to the world around us. Many of us identify as neurodivergent or simply sensitive. We are the artists, makers, and observers of our world. We often allow our empathy to guide us. We take note of signals that hint at the lessons and information we need to pay attention to. Historically, such figures were medicine people and keepers of the oracle. In order for these individuals to truly hone their craft and listen to all of the subtle signals in the world, whether to study herbs and botany, or to quiet their minds and receive divine messages, they would isolate themselves from society and live on the edges of it. they would become edge dwellers. In traditional lore and storytelling, these edge dwellers were often known as wise people who would settle away from the village in order to gain enough perspective to guide the people in it. Similarly, seers and mages would need to be able to study the signs and practice their rituals and magic in peace. They would collect their materials from the natural world in solitude. In the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot, the archetype of the hermit is represented by a wise person, with a grey beard who's dressed in a white travelling cape, and who walks with a lantern and staff through hilly terrain on a journey illuminated by a guiding star. This image encapsulates aspects of a learned individual, in solitude, showing signs of age, and willing to walk among us, yet comfortable on the edges to pursue their quest for deeper knowledge. The edge of town, or the edge of a village, often has eerie, mystical, or scary connotations that suggest this is the place where little ones do not go. The edge of town is where the witch dwells, or where those that do not want to be found make their home. Even today, we can drive people in society to the edge in the sense that they feel that they need to isolate themselves in order to exist among everyone else. So I'll start to go into Mrs. Jones in a moment, but I think there's something that's really important here. This book is about not being isolated and not being alone. It's about living in community. It's about how deeply interconnected our world is, the universe is, how much the people around us reflect aspects of ourselves back to us. And I think through this book, and it's something for you to explore when you read it, if you read it, there are a lot of prompts for us to think about what our relationship is to ourselves and the people around us and the environment around us. And I think it's really important for us not to romanticize this notion of living on the edge, of being a seer, of being someone who's isolated. Having that psychic sight or having that intuition or having that power, it's your choice what you do with it. But I think it's also important to reflect that we're of nature, we're deeply connected to it, and we're not separate from it. So that takes me on to Mrs. Jones. Embodying the energy and magic of the edge dweller. When I was about 5 years old, our science teacher in elementary school, Mrs. Jones, created a magical space in our classroom. She used this space to teach us the rules of the circle of life. As she worded it, the circle of life was the circle of life and death. All things that begin must come to an end, and that was something we needed to get comfortable with, because it was coming for all of us. However, her lesson was a subtle one, which she taught with plenty of joy, love, and fun. In our classroom, nearly 35 different types of animals lived in tanks, in cages, on shelves running the length of the room. There were tarantulas, garden snakes, chinchillas, rats, ferrets, hamsters, guinea pigs, mice, armadillos, iguanas, praying mantises, frogs, toads, turtles, gerbils, beetles, and pigeons. In the southeastern corner of the classroom sat a pen of her own construction, built from pine and thick chicken wire. This space was called the Peaceable Kingdom, where several species of animals that should not coexist lived together. Here, the pigeon-dove hybrid lived alongside baby turtles, and garden snakes zipped their way around rats. Miss Jones was an early proponent of upcycling. She would come to the lunch canteen and collect leftover crusts, pieces of cheese, and veggies. She had a little metal food trolley with wheels that clattered as she happily asked the little ones if they were done with their scraps. Eventually, there were dedicated trays where we could deposit our leftovers at the end of our meal, ready for collection by Miss Jones as soon as she arrived with her trolley. Miss Jones often hummed Stevie Wonder songs as she rolled the trolley through the halls, back to her tropical animal oasis. Later, you could see bits of your salad being munched by the bunnies, happily bouncing away in their cage in her classroom, or pieces of pizza being devoured by the chinchillas when they rolled out of their self-created dust balls. Pizza was always popular. I'm not sure if school regulations were particularly relaxed in the late 90s and early 2000s, or if Miss Jones got away with her unconventional classroom antics because she taught in a private school, but it was a wild time. Ours was an independent school for children from kindergarten through 12th grade. However, the school suddenly went into administration, and I remember watching teachers sobbing after an emergency meeting. Most of them had just been dismissed and were tearful in the aftermath of losing their jobs. The arts teachers were the first to go, although our librarian volunteered to stay in her post until the school year came to an end. It was, of course, Miss Jones, the stoic confidant, who I saw consoling other teachers after that fateful meeting. She was the one to offer them coffee, tea, and water, and provide them with a listening ear. I watched as fellow teachers sobbed on her shoulder, where the rat or two that she always had on her person would scurry away to avoid being crushed. She consoled others when her own fate was on similar tenterhooks. She always showed an incredible amount of compassion in the face of massive change. In the event, the actions of parents, teachers, students, and the wider school authorities' efforts ensured the school did not close. But Miss Jones gave us the equanimity to face whatever lay ahead. It was Miss Jones who repeated in each science lesson, we must learn to let go. That life is too short to hold grudges, and that forgiveness is key to living a long, healthy life. She talked about how holding on to resentments could build up and negatively impact the body. Little did she know, or maybe she was very aware, that she was talking about the energy that can build up from negative emotions and impact our bodies, if not released. Her encouragement to accept endings came in very handy in the midst of our school crisis. She was also preparing me for an incredibly important lesson, that it would take an ending, no matter how difficult, sudden, violent, or unexpected, to birth new life or to bring about change. The beauty of a new beginning could not exist without the ending that would one day follow it. And you might listen to this and think, well, my experience of speaking out or my experience of disruption is very different to this, or I have no interest in being disruptive in my life. But I think, especially given the time that we're living in now, as people are challenging and questioning authority, challenging and questioning the institutions that we are surrounded by, and I would say because of the abuses of power, because of how power is held by people in positions of authority and leadership, and also because we're living in a world with more technology, more access to information, this whole notion of challenge is something that comes up regularly. And I think rather than focusing on whether or not our world is more polarized or people are more opinionated, I think there's something here about that moment of coming together, not in conflict, but in challenge. And I mention this because I was talking about discernment there. It's not always possible for us to speak out. Maybe we're in a situation where our jobs are threatened. Maybe we don't feel it's necessary. But also, what I'd like us to remember as well, especially because I've been working within lots of activist communities and spaces, is that moment that someone comes to you and says, I think differently, or I'd like to speak up, or I don't agree, is a real act of love. And I think that's what the kind of core message is of this book. If someone didn't care to change things or care to speak out, they wouldn't bother. They would leave the situation. But that act of going, this is an invitation for us to change things, to have a discussion, to challenge, to maybe transform and build a different world, is an entirely and completely distilled, pure act of love. And I think sometimes when we're confronted with something or we feel challenged, we can get defensive, we can step back, we can find it really tricky. And all of those feelings and emotions are valid. It's not about dismissing them, it's not about saying we should feel anything different, but kind of processing those emotions and feeling them and allowing us to sit with them gives us that time and space to say, actually, these emotions are here. What are they bringing up in my body? What are they kind of triggering in me emotively, psychologically? What's coming up from my past? And how do I actually work with the energy of my feelings and emotions and transmute that into something that allows me to engage or disengage? It is about consent. It's about choice. And it's very much about how do we cultivate this relationship to this process. So I'll stop there. I should say I'm quite used to kind of having, I don't mind speaking about the book, but I'm also quite used to having questions. So sometimes I think to myself, I can share many different bits of this, but I'm really curious to hear what you're interested in and what you think. So any questions? Yes. One in the back and then here. Olivia. Yes.
Does Miss Jones know the impact? So I just think it's a big deal when someone really has an impact to be able to tell her.
Yeah. So Miss Jones hello, come in. Miss Jones in her edge dweller style is very hard to track down.
No.
So she might be around, and sorry for those that have just come in, we're talking about this magician, seer and edge dweller, talking about how living on the edges kind of enables us to have that perspective on society, on our life, and on our relationships. And the first reading I did was about kind of her presence in my life. So the answer is she doesn't know. I went to the States last month for the first time in 6 years and went back to my old school and tried to find her. There's no trace of the school. There's no trace of her. It's hard to find any of the teachers. So it continues to be a bit of a mystery.
She's been beamed up. She's gone home. She's done.
I think she is done. But yes, she doesn't know yet, but I intend for her to know soon. Great question. Thank you. Question here.
No.
Or comment.
Question.
Please.
Yes, I'm continuously at war with
Yeah.
a management committee.
Oh, I know that deeply.
So on the surface, it's
Yeah.
all about logic and rational
Rationality, yeah.
decisions, and underneath the surface, it's all about group dynamics.
Yeah, always.
And I find it almost an impossible situation to get
Nav-
through, to grapple with, to get other people to grapple with.
Mhm.
What do I do?
Great question. I have some more questions for you. So something I should admit, which might bore everyone in this room, but I've sat on a lot of boards and management committees. I'm very geeky about things like governance, and the reason why is because I'm fascinated by human behavior. Who has power in a room? If you're collectively trying to do something and achieve something, why? Who ended up in that room in the first place? Who's attracted to these positions of power? And my question back to you is, when you say that, you're navigating this, my first question is, what is your experience of being in that management committee, in that room? Are you listened to? Are you shut down? What are the dynamics? We need to know a bit more, without going into too much detail that you can't share.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm listened to for about 20 seconds, and then I'm closed down. Like, everybody, just, whoa, get this guy out of here.
I'm so sorry. And I think this comes back to this core question of values. What has brought everyone into that room? Why are they there? Which might not always be obvious. And also, it comes back to this question of, back to discernment and back to kind of thinking about the kind of impact on you energetically. Is it worth it being there for you? Does it continue to be? And if this is a space where you're not kind of honoured, respected, and people don't have a similar set of values to you, are there other spaces you could go? Is there somewhere you could be elsewhere that might be a better kind of environment? And then the second thing I would ask is, has that conversation ever happened? Has there ever been a collective discussion about why are we all here? What are our values? And back to kind of the dynamics of power and why people are attracted to power and who might be. Do people feel protected for a reason? Do they feel like their power is being taken away? And I think those are some kind of key questions to ask around that situation, to then go, is it worth me continuing to push to kind of changing people's minds if people feel that's even possible? And yeah, what are those energetic dynamics? What's the impact on you and your body in that space? And if it's for a collective vision you believe in, is that kind of fight worth it? Because I think this whole question of a war, that's part of it. There is a push and pull. I'm not saying it's these two binaries of pushing and pulling all the time when we're trying to change and transform things. But people are complex, the universe is complex, the world is complex, and that dynamic kind of back and forth is part of it. But where it starts to overpower, or where people are closing rank, or where people are protective and defensive, there's that real question of what's motivating that. Is that something that can be transformed and kind of collectively move through, or actually is that not possible? And again, it is about the gray areas. I don't think it's about a question of one or the other, but it does come down to how much of your energy is being exerted in that space. And is there another place that you could do that work or be involved? And the answer might be no, where you can create your own space that's more receptive. And I think something that I'll say last, not to kind of go on to this too much, but the whole question of living our values is also, are we in alignment in our lives? Are we actually facing resistance constantly at every corner, every turn? Do we feel like things are tricky? And I'm in no way kind of trying to undermine or diminish people's experiences, structural problems, experiences of oppression, poverty, marginalization. There are things that are out of your control sometimes. But if you're constantly attracted to environments that you face a lot of resistance, or you're constantly kind of going into them, there's a real question of why is that happening? And are there ways to make adjustments so that you're not constantly facing resistance? But sometimes it's good resistance.
Nope.
No. Well, okay, I'll give you another answer. I would say, see if you can find some friends and some allies. And if that really doesn't work, it might be a question of changing the circumstances, changing your perspective, and maybe moving on, or asking the awkward questions. Sometimes there's a real power to interrupting a pattern. And if there's a certain way of those meetings being held, the agenda is set the same way every time, it's the same people speaking, you get shot down every time, how can you pattern interrupt? What would kind of shift that a little bit? Is it a kind of new agenda item? Is it a new question? Is it bringing someone else in? And yes, maybe they won't hear it from you, which is horrible, but who else could give them that perspective and make them think, oh, there's something going on here. He's actually hammering on about something important. And I really feel for you in that environment.
Well, just let me explain what my reaction has been.
Yeah.
I've given up on working for the collective good.
That's valid.
And I come around to thinking, well, I'm just looking after my own interests.
That can happen, yeah.
And I'm not happy with either extreme.
Yeah.
I'm not happy.
Again, that resonates, and I know a question coming up over there, so we'll get to that soon, and we have another here. That resonates because that to me comes back to, and I won't call it this, I'm speaking about my own experience, the trauma of being shut down, of facing resistance, of trying so hard, and that impacts us. And that reaction of wanting to protect, to go, actually, I'm going to focus on my own needs and focus on myself, is a really natural reaction to that. And actually, what I would suggest is, how can you take a break? How can you not, and back to that passage about binaries and all or nothing thinking, how can we actually interrupt that situation, take a break, come back to it with new energy, come back to it with a different perspective, or take a break from being in the energy of that constant warring and constant fighting, which is impacting all of your decisions and your perspective on it, and going, okay, if I take a step back, with time and with healing and with kind of some space to be nurtured and cared for and loved and being in a space that's not resistance filled, how can you then recover? And that could be years. I'm not saying that's going to be an immediate thing, but that journey of kind of self-care, and I know that's used as such a massive buzz phrase, but of healing, whatever that looks like, can help, because that's such a natural reaction to that sort of situation. I've been there. Thank you for your question.
Just because I've been there.
Sorry, there's one question behind you, but go for this.
It was
Yeah,
a comment. So it was my
yeah,
question.
please.
Also a comment.
Beautiful,
Oh, yeah, yes, correct.
beautiful.
I was just going to say, I think when you're in a community space and you're working, especially a workspace, and you're receiving a lot of resistance, and as you said, you've gone from one extreme of just really hyper-focusing on the community and what you can do for a collective voice or a collective cause.
Yeah.
And then feeling rejected or feeling pushed away and then just sort of isolating and focusing on self. I think everybody has that experience on some level or some situation, but you listed a series of different suggestions of ways that you could navigate that option, and I think another one could be, you said ask the hard questions. If you do, I think asking the hard hard questions, confrontation is so constructive, but it doesn't have to be destructive.
Yeah.
And if you ask the hard questions and nobody's really being avoidant at that point, then you can come from a space of are we all in this space because we have a common goal? Probably. And then how can you have discussions around that common goal and reach that common goal together? Just because you have opposing views on something doesn't mean that you don't have a common goal.
Yeah.
So how can your different methods still reach that goal? Because it does seem that you would all be there in that space, and if you've agreed upon that common goal to reach it, and you could basically just have discussions around the method, which is what it sounds like. You have opposing views of how you would like to go about doing something or orchestrating something, and people have different ways of doing things, and somebody's always going to think theirs is better. But at the end of the day, when you are at work or working with a collective or community, it's about that common goal. It's more than all of you. So I think it's so important to withdraw and say I'm going to focus on myself, and I also think it's so important to be a part of a community and focus on that. But there is a both and. I wasn't here for the majority of the talk, but you've got binaries, but there's always the and.
Yeah.
And you could be on the two opposing ends, but there's something in the middle of that. There's a narrative involved.
Beautiful. Just a quick question. Could everyone hear that on this side?
Sorry.
I'll summarize really quickly. The kind of summary of that was, is everyone there for a collective goal, and actually are people kind of using different methods to get there? And that kind of, I know I'm really summarizing here, so forgive me. And that question of both and, so how could you, be in community, take space away from community and look after yourself, but also what are some of the other methods you might use? Anything else I missed?
I think that's good.
Beautiful. So we're coming to you. I'm so sorry. We have one more comment on this topic, and we'll come over here. Sophie.
It was just about knowing your role, and I've learned that sometimes I know where this is going to end. I've seen it, and sometimes you just have to sit there and be like, well, so that when it does happen, you can compassionately carry everyone that couldn't see. It's a big responsibility to be able to do that, and to be in the room where you know everyone hates you. You know, I'm here because I know we're going to crash. You're going to need me.
I think
to help, and it's so hard, and that's why I think you've done the right thing, because you've got to nurture yourself to be able to be there with the life jacket when it does inevitably break. I'll be like, and you don't want to say I told you, but I told you.
But I think that's beautiful. Knowing your role, and again, that question of being the edge dweller, the seer, the magician, maybe someone that's more wise, or not even more wise, someone that's just experienced that before. And that whole question of how do you hold that knowledge in this environment where you're seeing things play out? They've happened before, you've been there before, and actually how can you sit in that, I don't like the word power, but sit in that past experience to guide others? And also, how do you have some distance? Again, it's back to that discernment. What kind of amount of energy are you putting into that? And we're talking about energy in maybe less mystical terms in this kind of example, but this whole question of, okay, are you comfortable with this? Are you happy to kind of be the guide through the discomfort? Are you happy being disliked or kind of not listened to? And how much of that can you use to navigate that or not, or disengage? And what's the gray area? Can you be a guide for a bit and step back? I've been in so many situations where I see things unfold, or I was the canary in the coal mine and said, wait a minute, we're about to do this thing, and everyone's got, nope, this is what we're doing, sorry, we're not going to listen to you. But also, we have to remember the role of the ego, of people's own kind of motivations, and actually how shame, embarrassment, not wanting to have those things be pointed out also motivates people to kind of stay the course. And you talked about groupthink coming into that as well, but beautiful example. Yes, I'll come to you because we have a gentleman that's been waiting.
Real disruptors who have become targeted individuals.
Yes.
And for example, David Icke, he's been banned from speaking in 26 countries around Europe. Do you agree that's the real disruption, the work of disruption?
I think that's part of the work of disruption. I won't speak to kind of David Icke, but I think a lot of disruptors that have been really public and really visible and have not been afraid to speak out often get shunned, often get condemned, and sometimes they're ahead of their time. sometimes their truth, you know, when we think about, if we think about some of the archetypes in the book, or think about kind of the whole idea of the medicine person kind of providing that medicine, you getting a snake bite, there's someone that's there to draw out the poison, they're getting the poison instead. So it's kind of that disruptive role, and that's very much what this book is about. How do you come to terms with that? How do you sit with that? Are you comfortable with that? Is that something you navigate, you know, and that you're comfortable taking on that role? I've been a whistleblower and disruptor in many situations. In certain parts of my work, people are afraid of me, or don't want to engage, or go, oh, here comes Briana again, talking the same nonsense. And I say that with kind of a bit of jest, but it's there. And I think that kind of that power of kind of standing in truth, and I don't know if I want to use that phrase, that power of kind of standing in your truth, of pointing out things that are uncomfortable, comes with an element of that, because there's a real kind of auric of force that comes with that. And whether or not you're interested in human design, there's so many other kind of modalities to explore this. That is a deep power that resonates, and it's part of it that has a massive impact. I don't think everyone chooses that path. I don't think everyone necessarily goes that route. Sometimes the disruption is gentler, is quieter, it's kind of more self-focused, but kind of the ripples of that kind of choice and those decisions to kind of stand in that power are kind of core to the book and kind of what happens when you do that. So yes, I would say that's a big part of that process.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Briana.